Welcome to the latest Further Communications webinar on how to communicate successfully in a crisis. We often think of communication as what we're saying, what we're putting out there proactively, but it's equally as much about how we respond and what we say back. And nowhere is that more true than in a crisis. Warren Buffett was quoted as saying, it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to lose it. And our guest today will probably share with us that it can take less than 5 minutes to lose such a reputation. But it's for that reason that we're focusing this month on how we communicate effectively when things aren't going to plan. Our guest this time is Miriam. Miriam is our expert at Further in crisis communications and media communications. She has a huge range of experience. She's worked on the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Madeleine McCann investigation too, as well as many other things that I'm sure she can't talk about. Crisis averted. But more than that, the reason I wanted Miriam to join us today is because she's a good egg. And when she talks about all of these things, she has this huge depth of knowledge, but she can explain them in such practical, useful and engaging terms, which I think is really, really important when we're learning how to communicate successfully. So welcome, Miriam.
Thank you. And thank you for such a kind introduction. I'm very humbled. And it's a pleasure to be talking to you as ever.
And how has the week been for you so far? What can you tell us about what you've been up to?
It's been very good so far. I think it's if the week is allowed to start on Sunday rather than Monday, then it started excellently when Manchester United's third goal went in against Arsenal. So yeah, that was always going to put us on a sure footing for the rest of the week.
Absolutely. I forgot about your red roots, and I wondered why you were so smiley when we first met this morning. Obviously, that's it. I hope that all flows through into today's session and that all of our Manchester City and otherwise fans don't suddenly zoom out or click off.
Yeah, that's the risk.
With all of the webinars that we run, we think about the what, the why, the how, the where of these different areas of communication before getting into some really practical and useful tips that we can all take away. So I think the first question for you today is, what do we actually mean when we talk about a reputation threatening situation, which is a term you and I use, or a crisis when it comes to communication?
Well, I think that's the right place to start. And of course, it means different things to different organizations or companies. And if we're talking about necessarily then a kind of principle of what does a reputation threatening situation looks like, I would say it's anything that really puts in jeopardy an organization's relationship with its key, I hate this word, stakeholders, groups, audiences, customers, pupils if you're a school, donors, volunteers if you're a charity, and so on and so forth. So anything that risks fundamentally and negatively changing their perception of you. And in particular, you're in trouble if it's on an issue which is in direct conflict with your purpose and your sort of raison d'etre. So, I suppose if you're a police force, to borrow an example from my background and current interests as well, you're charged with protecting people, making people safer. If there are incidents which show the reverse, in which you're hurting people, or there's some kind of problem about how you're dealing with people, that's obviously going to hurt a lot more than, let's say, a challenging issue that doesn't reflect your engagement with the public. So like bureaucratic problems or whatever. But for a big accountancy firm, it might be a bureaucratic error that's the main challenge.
Cool. And I suppose these things happen, they will happen, but the ideal situation for us, and the reason people are probably watching and listening today, is because we want to avoid these situations happening in the first place. So what are the examples of situations that could become reputation threatening for an organization? What should we be looking out for?
So some, depending on, you know, what setting your the viewers and others are working for, again, it really depends on what their purpose is. But, you know, classic examples would be for a company that produces products, you know, some kind of defect, for a product that produces, for a company that produces food, some kind of contamination. But they tend to be almost the simpler ones to deal with. What can be more difficult and more unpredictable are those situations which are actually more common when it comes to crisis, and that's about behavior, whether that's, you know, poor working culture and behaviors. So the way that, you know, perhaps issues with, you know, I don't like to say it, but at lunchtime, but kind of abusive behavior from senior levels, or exploitative behavior. You know, we've seen various crises affecting companies around working practices and cultures and so on and so forth. I think also anything that people perceive as to be unjust, especially in the UK, you know, we like there's a sense of fair play, and companies that fall short of that sort of fair play, really things can take off quite quickly. Thinking about other examples, social media, clumsy posts. I could give a few examples if that's helpful, that have, I mean, you know, quite recent things. I noticed that because I have a special interest in schools, because I work with lots of schools and other education settings, and any Traitors fans out there, obviously there's been a lot of coverage this week. I don't know if anyone noticed, there was a story whereby the son of Rachel, who was one of the winners of this season, this series.
Spoiler alert.
Yes, sorry, spoiler alert. If you haven't caught up yet, you should have done. You've had 5 days or whatever it is. Spoiler alert, the son of one of Rachel's children, the school that child attends, put something out on social media naming the child. They were obviously very excited. They gave loads of detail. Obviously his school was identified, his name was identified, and so on and so forth. And that was quickly it went viral on social media. It was quickly pointed out to them, and they had to kind of reel back. And I understand exactly how that kind of situation happens. And often these sort of crises occur because with the best of intentions, someone hasn't thought the consequences through. And so that can happen as well. Yeah, did that answer your question?
It did. It sort of shows these are some of the things that can become reputation threatening for the organization. And again, people that are watching and listening today will be at different parts, levels, areas of the organization, but they'll want, I think, to be listening out for when those things might become a crisis, when they become reputation threatening. Yeah. So what are the early warning signs, internal or external? And I know all of these terrible things that you've talked about happen day to day, and they shouldn't within organizations, but what are the early warning signs that they're going to become a reputational crisis externally?
Well, I will look out for. You reminded me, Rich, of the point another point I wanted to make to the previous question, which is an important one. I think when you talk about people within an organization, very often it's not the people who you might think are charged with communications for an organization or company that are either at the root of a crisis or in the position to kind of prevent a crisis from occurring. Often it's the people kind of in the front line of that organization or company, the person who picks up the phone, the person who's, let's say, manning or staffing the barrier, for Great Western Railway at Paddington Station. Your impression of Great Western Railway is going to be formed by that person, not somebody in an office, however far away. So I just wanted to make the point that people at all levels of an organization are kind of critical custodians of the company's reputation. And also to the question about early warning signs, those people are often as well, at different levels in an organization, the most tuned in to those indicators that can flag that there's trouble ahead. So, for example, I suppose a complaint, is the obvious one. Again, speaking generically, a complaint coming into a school, a complaint coming into a charity, a complaint coming into a university or a college or whatever, that can be your first indicator. Or it may be something in the public domain, so a comment on your Facebook profile, on the company's organization's Facebook profile, or something on X, or one of those sorts of things. And then really that can be the starting point for an escalation, and the early warning signs kind of fall under that. So it's kind of, what are people's responses, if any? Is there any response to that negative comment, that criticism? Do you sense that in addition to that public facing criticism, there's chatter on kind of WhatsApps or other groups who might be connected with your organization? Do you see a kind of expansion or a splintering of arenas? So if there's complaints on X, let's say, you're also seeing things now being put on Facebook or some other, on Instagram or whatever. And then when you kind of, a much more obvious, I suppose, example of when that you've got an issue is if you get a call from a journalist. And I've dealt quite the case recently that sort of springs to mind is of a company that provides services for vulnerable adults, and they had some criticism on LinkedIn, and it was very unfair, I hasten to add, and it was flawed criticism. There was completely no basis to it, but what happened was, you obviously have journalists and others kind of scouting through LinkedIn trying to look for low-hanging fruit stories, as I would think of them, and they then had a call from a journalist and were asked to account for themselves. So those can be some of the indicators, and that would suggest that you need to start doing some preparation.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing is a lot of those early warning indicators, they're not just seen by the big boss of the organization who's in charge of monitoring what's going on externally and looking out for reputational threatening things. They're picked up by people all over the organization. So just in your experience or opinion, are organizations actually good at making sure their people know when to raise the alarm and what to look out for?
It's a great question.
Are they any good?
That's a great question. I think sometimes leaders and managers can make the mistake of not recognizing the value of more junior staff and teams on their front lines. And I mean, particularly in cases, I also work with charities who, again, look after vulnerable people in residential units, and the staff in those units, frontline staff, they may be care workers, they may be contract workers. They are the ones who you are dependent on for your reputation to tell you that there's been an incident, that there's been an accident, that there's been someone knocking at the door complaining from the neighborhood, that there might be a journalist asking what goes on in that building, and so there is a degree to which that's the case, I would say. I'm sorry, I've lost the thread. I've totally forgotten what I think I've not answered your question.
In terms of, are organizations good at flagging and having a culture of people knowing when to flag, what to highlight, and things in terms of what is a crisis? Yeah, no,
thank you. That is a really important part, I think, of operational effectiveness. I think you have to recognize that people at all levels should be aware of what would constitute a reputational crisis for your organization, and know how and when to escalate that, just to recognize it. And that's when I said earlier about everybody being the custodians of an organization's reputation. That's the key thing, really, is that nobody thinks this is someone else's job. And of course, you might have somebody who's, typical situation, you might have let's say a college or a school sending out a communication to everybody, and the person who's actually pressing send on that email might be a personal assistant or a secretarial support of some sort, and they see something absolutely critical that would mean, or they might have a view that actually the tone is wrong, and those people should be listened to because they are close to the knowing what's expected from the outside of how you behave and how you treat people.
Yeah, it's very true. And it reminds me of organizations I've worked in where they've had this culture of crisis communication is everybody's responsibility, or crisis recognition. Absolutely. And it made a lot of people quite fearful initially, but as that seeped through the culture, it actually saved the organization probably on more times than they will ever know, because people were so heightened to watching out for these things. Which brings us nicely onto in your experience, Miriam, what impact can having good communication have on dealing with a reputational crisis and avoiding it turning into something bigger or worse?
I think the way that an organization responds to a difficult situation can often be, really, people are instinctively, perhaps even without even kind of subconsciously, judging that organization. Is this the company, is Apple the company that I thought it was, if they're going to not respond to this big tech failure in a way that I would imagine? There's one, I think that there are opportunities in crisis. There's one example that I found very interesting was, I don't know if you were, a couple of years ago, I think towards the end of 2024, there was a dairy company, a cheese company, in Neal's Yard cheeses, I think they're called, and they are very successful, but relatively small business operating in central London, selling cheeses from all over the country, and they were the victims of the most horrendous crime. It was a fraud. They lost £300,000 worth of product. And that was devastating to such a small business, and it got lots of attention, obviously, because it's quite an unusual thing to happen, and it was a very sophisticated fraud. But what I found very interesting and about their response, which I think can help answer your question and teach us something, is that they immediately said, they acted very quickly, and they immediately said, one of the things they said was that they would pay their suppliers, that this theft was going to have a huge impact on their bottom line, but that they valued their suppliers, and they recognized that they would not want to pass on the vulnerabilities that they'd experienced to anyone else. And they immediately said that they would do that, they would cover that. And I thought that was I'm sure that it came from the most authentic place, and it wasn't intended to be, well, let's make the most of this awful situation. But I think it was a very good instinct. It demonstrated their values, and I think crises do offer that opportunity to companies and organizations to really say, what are we about here, and how is our response going to reflect that? At the end of the day, your crisis response is really just a reflection of your operational decision making after something bad's happened.
Absolutely. And you were sharing with me a little bit earlier an example from a cafe near you. I mean, can you tell me again, but tell everybody else about this example? I
was very lucky in that situation, but about a year ago, there was a terrible outage of, it was a burst water main very near me, and thousands of people, the water main affected the gas supply, and it was the middle of winter, it was December going into January, and thousands of people were left without hot water and gas, so no central heating, no hot water, and that went on for weeks. And unfortunately, there was a relatively new cafe near me that were deeply affected. Their restaurant more than a cafe, but they decided to kind of, even they pulled heaters in, they knew people were cold, they served coffee, they couldn't serve food anymore because they couldn't operate the ovens and so on, but they kind of stepped up, and that obviously went round in the community, in the neighborhood, on social media, all of the kind of local Facebook groups and what have you, WhatsApp groups, and they gained so much support because they stepped up in that moment. And so they showed their true nature. And I think it doesn't matter whether you're a company, whether you're a cafe, or whether you're Apple or British Airways or whatever, the way you react in crisis will be scrutinized and help create people's perceptions of you going forward.
I love that, because it reframes a little bit that every crisis is not a terrible thing. Obviously it is in that first few moments, but it can be a huge opportunity commercially and reputationally.
Can I give you one more tiny example?
Oh, please do. I love good news. Go on.
Okay, so I don't know if you remember, about a couple of months ago, Waitrose in Cheadle got into trouble. Cheadle in South Manchester, because a young man, I think he's 27, 28, a guy by the name of Tom Boyds, who had worked for, I think it was something like 600 or 700 hours at this Waitrose for unpaid. He has autism, and he was working unpaid in Waitrose, you know, as in that role. And after a while, I think, and quite justifiably, in conjunction with his mother, she asked that he should be just paid something, because she recognized that he wasn't feeling, he'd understood that most people get paid and he wasn't getting paid. And she put on social media that he'd asked his bosses if he could be paid, and they'd said no. Now, I'm sure the HR manager or whoever decided that had no idea of what would happen next. But what happened next was, as I say, mum put it on social media, and it went viral. And this sense of that's not fair play. This man has worked 600 or 700 hours in this store and given his time. And yes, he's learnt and benefited from that experience. But this is a very, very big company, very profitable company. And it's very harsh and unfair that they're not doing that, they're not giving him any work or money whatsoever. What happened next was that Asda in Cheadle stepped in and said, well, we'll give him a job. And they did. And then Waitrose came back after. It was a huge hoo-ha. I mean, it made national news on pretty much all the outlets, every newspaper and so on. It went from that one Facebook comment to every outlet. And then he was sort of inundated with offers, I think, happily. And I understand that he's shortly returning to Waitrose in a proper role. So good example, perhaps, of how something completely unexpected can create.
It is great news, positive news. I love stories like that. I've scribbled a note that I want to make sure I hunt that down again and reshare it as a great example and takeaway from our time today. We talked a little bit earlier, before we get into the really practical tips, we talked a bit earlier about how it's everybody's responsibility to look out for things that can be reputationally damaging. Mm-hmm. But surely someone has to start this within an organization, or like prompt or lead on it. Where does that responsibility generally fall within an organization in your experience?
So, you know, you typically would have some form of team that deals with marketing and communications. And again, it really depends on the organization. But very often, for example, in a charity or in a school or college, you would find that, you know, there's multiple responsibilities falling to that team. So it can tend to be more proactive, you know, pushing out marketing, getting brochures and advertising and all sorts of materials ready. And so that task of horizon scanning, of really making sure that you're well prepared for any challenges that come along, that can often be avoided, or it can often fall through the gaps, I suppose. And so I really would emphasize that it's very much everybody's role to listen to what customers, what, you know, your stakeholders are saying about you, and really engage in a constant monitoring process to think about the kinds of risks that could come up and affect your reputation. Clearly, it's a task of this, you know, at the end of the day, it's the CEO or it's the director. In the Metropolitan Police, it's the commissioner. You know, in government, it's the Prime Minister, and those are the people. But it, you know, clearly the responsibility for safeguarding the organization's reputation falls across multiple different levels and people.
It does. Cool. That's great. And it's given me a great idea about who needs to be in the room to start that conversation, or if you're listening and your organization isn't thinking about their reputation management, who you need to go and bother or say this is really important. So that's useful. It's that marketing comms team, but it's got that overall leadership responsibility, and that day-to-day, we're all part of this.
Yeah, definitely.
So we move on to the more practical area, because one of the things, as I keep saying within these further webinars, is we want to make sure people have got practical ideas and focuses to take away. I know whenever I'm listening to a webinar, I've always got a little notepad next to me and I scribble 1 or 2, maybe 3 key lessons. So Miriam, what are 3 practical things that we can all do to be more successful when dealing with a crisis?
Well, I think you led into this very nicely with what you just said, actually, because my first kind of, I suppose, strong tip would be avoid it happening in the first place? You know, it sounds really obvious, but that process of an ongoing process, implementing as part of your, you know, business as usual operational strategy, building in a risk mitigation, landscape, horizon scanning function, and that's your best defense against reputational harm. And this is what I, you know, with the organizations that I work with, we do implement that, a monthly meeting where we can talk about what's bubbling under the surface. Are there any, it might be that you have an issue with staff, with complaints, with you know, grumblings about, to use an example from the education sector again, pensions. There's been lots about TPS and those kinds of things. Are there any problematic situations beginning to develop? Is there any conflict? Have there been complaints or an increase in complaints? Is the company somehow going to have to cut its offering or change what it does? So really just a real check-in with a sole focus on what could go wrong here based on how everything else is happening. Do we have a decline in numbers? Are we feeling vulnerable with our profits or our donations if we're a charity? Those kinds of things. Is there anything that might go wrong? So that would be my first point, I suppose, is to try and avoid it happening.
So yes, have that horizon scanning
there
going on. Those that kind of process of looking out, watching a radar type thing. A question on that. So your first tip is horizon scanning. How advanced does that have to be? What format does that sort of horizon scanning have to take?
I think it just has to be dedicated time with the right people around the table. And actually, it doesn't even need to be more than 20 minutes or half an hour. It's literally saying, okay, taking a step back and zooming out from the kind of the day-to-day minutiae of operating the business or organization. What do we, it may be that you already have a risk register, right, which is a very good starting point for this exercise. But it's essentially, okay, let's taking everything in the round. How do we feel things are going? Where are we at the moment? Where do we see the people around the table, the biggest risks coming from? What are our frontline staff telling us about what they're sensing and feeling? You know, you can't prepare for everything, but you can do a whole lot more than a lot of companies and organizations do at the moment.
Cool. So that's your first tip then, horizon scanning, having that radar. What's the second thing we should take away and do?
The second thing I think would be act quickly, act really quickly, because, you know, in our generation, I think we've seen a huge fundamental shift in the amount of time that an organization or company has before they actually do something. You know, we live in an age where issues, problems, developments are shared instantly, obviously, and globally, and can escalate very, very quickly within a matter of minutes. So the first thing to do is not to sit back and wait till next week until, you know, the CEO is back from their holiday or whatever before you decide what to do. You don't have that luxury. You have to act right now. And the benefit of doing that as well is that you get to, at least you hope to get to, shape the narrative as this is evolving. So depending on the situation, again, you know, you want your voice to be the first out there, or if not the first, then very close afterwards, to be saying something. And sometimes, you know, that can be a very sad situation. That can be something that's in the news that has you've been linked with. You know, I'm thinking of very sadly, you know, where a school might lose a pupil in a terrible situation. They've got to then they will be named immediately without necessarily being involved or having any involvement with the circumstances of that loss. And so you have to really be in if you say nothing at that point for days and days, that looks terrible. And that looks like you don't care. That looks like you're not responsive and that you're not feeling sad about what's happened. So you have to act really, really quickly. Yeah. That's tip number
organizations, businesses don't always act quickly. They can be slow and clunky, and people want to sign things off and
that's right.
make sure they've checked every comma and every full stop. How do you, or the organizations you work with, make sure that they do or can act quickly? What do they do to act quickly?
so important, because, and you're absolutely right, there's a temptation, I think, with an organization that any evolving crisis should be seen as any other problem or issue that's going on, but actually the stakes are so much higher when it comes to reputational risk than, say, I don't know, a recruitment crisis, which can be very, that's going to have a big impact. But if something's happening that could fundamentally affect your people's perception of your purpose, your mission, that is something that has to be responded to immediately. And the way that I recommend doing that is to form a gold group, and this is borrowing my police analogies from years ago, and I think it's something that's pretty standard now anyway, is that the organization, the leader of that organization or company, needs to work out who they need around the table very quickly, and it has to take priority over everything else that's going on. And if you can't get people physically, it's virtually, and everybody needs to be involved in those initial discussions, and they need to take priority. I think for companies, organizations that don't see that risk, my job is to spell out the consequences of not acting quickly, of if they're dealing with an issue that might involve campaign groups that are against their function, they will lose ground, and they may well lose the war, not just that particular battle. So it's very important.
Cool. Okay. So your first two tips were scan the horizon, act quickly with your gold group. Yeah. What's the final big piece of practical advice we can take away today when dealing with a reputationally threatening situation?
So I'm going to roll a couple of things into one, which is, if I'm allowed, which is essentially, obviously, think about what you're going to say, who you're going to say it to, and crucially, recognizing that not everyone that you're speaking to falls into the same boat. So I can't think of an organization or a company that doesn't have more than one type of stakeholder. A school is an obvious example, but the way you want to say something to your staff will differ from the way you want to say something to the parents. The way that a charity will want to communicate with its donors will be different to its volunteers, will be different to potential grant-making foundations. So, but having said that, the messaging needs to be really consistent. You just need to recognize that each of those individual groups will have their own priorities, their own concerns, their own particular take on the issue that you're talking about, and you have to think ahead about that and work out as well, next point within this one point, the sequencing. So how are you going to, what's the order in which you're going to share this information? It's obviously very important in most situations that you speak to your staff before your customers. Now, that's not always the case. You might have a situation where, again, going back to school, your parent, your staff member, your governors, and even a journalist is the same person, that you might be talking to someone who's going to get this information from 3 or 4 different directions. So it needs to be the same message to all. You can't get away with saying one thing on social media and another thing to a particular set. It has to be the same message, but you have to nuance those messages based on who you're talking to.
Brilliant. So scan the horizon, act quickly, and then know what you're going to say and who you're going to say it to, in what order.
Exactly.
3 practical great steps, tips and ideas that you can take away and put into your team, your organization, or whatever cause it may be that you're working on. When things go well, when organizations are successful, Miriam, what is the one thing that they all do, that one thing that matters most for organizations that successfully navigate difficult communications like this?
One word, I would say: authenticity. Don't try and be anything you're not. You remember who you are. Go back to what you say on your website, in the public domain, about what your purpose is and what your values are. Because too often, I think companies and organizations are at risk of seeing their values as just something they put on the website, and then they don't need to come back to them. People will judge you on how true you are to who you say you are. So authenticity. So I'd say that's the one key thing, is in a moment of crisis is a moment to think, right, our response needs to reflect our personality, our values, our ethics, and of who we say we are, and that's how we're going to respond.
We all know, don't we, when a communication comes out, whether it's in a crisis or elsewhere, if it's not authentic, it doesn't feel right. It feels like it's been manufactured or written by committee to deal with something we know. Yeah.
Or written by AI. Let's go there. I mean, you know, very useful. Not saying don't use it, obviously, incredibly. You know, I'm not an AI expert, so I'm not going to go fully down that road. But I will say that generic communications responses, I think we're at risk of the kind of cut and paste approach of let's take this off. And they don't, of course, they don't encompass how your customers or how your parents or how your donors or how your volunteers see you. It doesn't encompass the thoughts in your head about where you want that organization to go, or the concerns of your staff, or anything. So yes, helpful tool in a way, but not but very, you know, heavy dose of caution about that, because it doesn't allow you to be authentic. It doesn't allow you to visit your values.
Yes, in a crisis, that is the time to be human, isn't it? More than any other point. And talking of humans, we have a few who have sent in some questions for you to round off today, which I think is also quite authentic for Further, because we're always about making sure our learners, the people we're working with, have what they need. So we have 3 questions for you from the audience, from the outside world here. The first of which is, does today's media landscape with so many different channels make it harder to manage and respond to crisis? And how do we adapt for this?
That's an excellent question. You know, I actually think, having worked previously in kind of proactive PR as well, so trying to place stories for organizations and companies, I actually think it made that kind of fragmentation of the media landscape, which your questioner so insightfully picked upon, is a more of a challenge when you're trying to get a good story out, when you're trying to share, you know, an update or something positive about your organization, because the news that we all consume is now so fragmented. You can completely miss almost a big story. We're only shown on social media things that it thinks we'll be interested in, and so on and so forth. So unless you're making a big effort, or you expect your kind of target audiences to make a big effort to look across the board, it can be quite hard to get that cut through now. When it comes to a crisis, in a way, it goes back to that consistent message being shared across all those platforms where you think people see you, where the most important groups are for you. And so, you know, there'll be lots of organizations and companies that don't have, for example, a presence on Instagram, but will have it on LinkedIn, or vice versa. So where are your people? Where are your sort of tribes, to use that marketing term? And then, and then essentially making sure that in a crisis, you think through how you're going to reach all of those different groups. But again, really being mindful of sequencing, so that you don't want, for example, a really loyal customer or person who's been, you know, let's say a donor to your charity, who's been giving support for 15 or 20 years, to hear that at the same time as random Joe from Stoke-on-Trent, who's never heard of you and may not be likely to give you a donation. They deserve more than that. So you want to make sure that anything that goes on all those different platforms is really thought through. Has your very long-standing loyal donor heard this before Joe in Stoke-on-Trent?
Excellent. Thank you. And then our second question is, who should be saying what in a crisis? Do different levels of the organization have different responsibilities, or can anyone speak?
Brilliant question. And I think it's a really important question. Very recently, I was dealing with an organization, and they were, let's say that it was a school. And as we all know, league tables are published about schools, and it was a local piece of coverage, and it was a special school. And one of the people who, you know, very, very, very talented lower level member of staff at the school took objection to the report, even though they weren't particularly directly criticised. And without discussing this with anyone else in the school, they took it upon themselves to write to that to the outlet, and there was a bit of work to do after that, as you can imagine. So it's fantastic that that school has someone passionate and caring enough to take that step to really say, well, hang on a minute, we're doing a fantastic job here and you've missed X, Y, and Z. But really, any organisation, however big or small, needs to make sure that that message is consistent. And the only way it can be consistent is if there's a shared approach to how that messaging is shared. So no, it's not okay for everybody to take responsibility for sharing, you know, for speaking to journalists left, right and centre if that's what's going on, as well as, for example, the nominated spokesperson who could be at a different level of seniority. However, what is important is that everyone in that organisation knows what is being said externally. So, for example, when they're later in the, you know, going out with their family, or they're in the pub that night and somebody says, oh, I've heard there's trouble in your organisation, that they are well equipped and they understand what's happened and what they can and can't say, or what their take on it is as an organisation, and that they are able to do that. So I think it's, and for that you need good internal communications. You need everybody in the organisation to be treated with respect, that if there is an issue that's hit the press, they should be told about how that's happened, about what the position is of the organisation, and what they should and can say if they're asked about it, so that they feel they've been properly informed.
Great. And then our final question is a really interesting one. Should I refuse to say something if I don't agree with it or think it is untrue? So I assume this person is a spokesperson on behalf of the organisation.
Okay, yes. So there's two potential versions of that question. I guess either they're someone within an organisation that's been asked to say something they don't think is true, which is how you've heard that. I wondered whether it was about if they're asking they should say no comment if they don't agree with it. I wasn't sure, but I don't know. I'll answer your version. That's, for me, is about, if it's about you don't agree with what's being said and you think it's untrue, then you are, I would say, as a former press officer and, you know, someone who's represented all different organizations, you know, in a press office to the outside world, you're putting yourself in a very vulnerable position if you do that. And so because you will be involved in the process where you're telling something that may not be true externally, and that's hugely risky. So I think in most cases where that's the case, where, you know, if there's a message that's come from above, this is what we'd like you to share, and that's shared, that person probably believes that that's the truth because that's what they've been told. If they've got a view that that might not be the truth, then I would say pause on it, challenge internally, find out, you know, and see if you can get some satisfaction around the evidence base for what you're being asked to share. I think you do have that responsibility. You're not just a mouthpiece. If it's the second version of that question, which is, should I say something like, let's say a journalist comes along with a scurrilous story and it's just rubbish and we know it's rubbish and we don't want to answer it, so we're just going to say we're not discussing this with you. I think we need to distinguish between not answering the question and not engaging in the first place, or not saying anything and not engaging in the first place. You should, my view would be, it's really important for organizations and companies to always engage with journalists, even when they're completely wrong, or they're out for, you know, you might feel that they're out to create trouble, or a scandalous story or whatever. It's always, it's never a good idea to ignore a journalist. They'll just come back bigger and harder, or if they've really got something on you, you'd be in even bigger trouble. That said, also you may want to, if that's the case, obviously use that opportunity to guide the journalist that there is no story here, that they've actually got their facts wrong. You know, there are ways of speaking depending on the context, on the circumstances, and just guiding a journalist that they're wrong, you know, that there's no information that would support their claim. And in the vast majority of cases, if you are able to have that background conversation where you can prove that that's the case, they might leave you alone. if not, and they're still insistent on running a story, you have got the opportunity then to put something together for them that would rebuff the basis of their story. But no comment, no reaction, ignoring them, hiding under the duvet and hoping they go away is not advisable.
Brilliant. Thank you. You have given us, Miriam, so much inspiration, so many ideas, so many thoughts. You've highlighted the importance of communicating well in these situations and given us some great techniques. I've got a huge list of takeaways here, not just your tips of scanning the horizon, acting quickly and knowing what and who you're saying it to, but the idea of gold groups or golden groups to respond to these things was really powerful for me. And of course, the fact that everybody has a responsibility. So if you're not considering how you respond in a crisis right now, you should be, because if it hasn't happened yet, sadly, it probably will at some point.
Yeah.
If people have more questions, need more support, of course, this is about as salesy as it gets, but you are available through Further to do consultancy. You run training sessions on all of the things we've talked about today, as well as representing yourself well in the media and interviews and those kinds of skills too. Yeah. So any questions, any support that Miriam can give you, please do contact us, because as I say, and as you now know, she is brilliant. Thank you, Miriam, for all of your time today. I'm off to scribble out some notes and make these into something even more useful that will go out to all of the people who have watched and subscribed to this webinar, and will be shared on the furthercommunications.co.uk website as well. And if you don't already, follow us on LinkedIn and you can get links to more sessions like this and lots of useful communication skills resources too. So thank you very much, Miriam.
It's been such a pleasure and an honor to speak to you. Thank you.
We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
All the best.